Okay, good morning, everyone. We are in 2 Samuel 12, and this is the story of David and Bathsheba. We've already been looking at that in chapter 11. Remember, our break-off point between the chapters was basically the end of David's actions and all of the bad decisions that he made along the way. He got to the point where he had killed Uriah the Hittite, and waited for Bathsheba to have that appropriate period of mourning, and then takes her as his wife to give plausible deniability, at least. So she's pregnant with his child. There might be a little bit of wondering. That seems a little bit quick for a baby to come, but you know, sometimes babies come a little early or people aren't paying that close attention. Maybe David can get away with it. Of course, we know that David is not going to get away with it because God has something to say about this. So one of the observations we made in the last chapter was how much the phrase David sent was in it. All of the sending that David did, showing his authority and his overt action, just as he sent those soldiers to fight for their nation and to fight on his behalf. So did he send for messengers to determine who Bathsheba was, to bring her to him, to send Uriah back with orders for his own execution, all sorts of things like that. Now we're going to transition in verse 1 of chapter 12, where it says, "And the Lord sent Nathan to David." So we've had lots of David's actions. Now we'll get to see some of God's actions. There are a couple things that this chapter is going to help reveal for us. One, that even though David is king, he's not above correction. In a lot of these nations, the king was viewed as the very highest authority. Everything that he did was right by virtue of being king. And there's nobody in a position to be able to criticize the king because he can have them put to death. And so will David's sinful actions be criticized, be condemned, be punished? Or is David going to be able to get away with this sin? We also are going to be comparing David with Saul, because you will remember that Saul started off pretty good before he ended up leaving God. David was better than Saul was at his beginning. I think David starts from a higher place even than Saul. But that doesn't mean that he can't fall like Saul did. So is this the beginning of the end for David, or can he come out of this hole? I know we know the answers to these questions, but it's still useful for us to see how it develops over the course of this chapter. So the Lord sent Nathan to David, and what is Nathan's message to David? Dave.
Well, God had Nathan go to David and meet Harold. Yeah. A man's animal being sold, and kind of led him into it.
Yeah.
And so, in doing so, David became very angry. How dare you, basically, I'm kidding you, kind of like that. No, not acceptable, blah, 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 blah. And as we're going to see at the end of that whole thing, you're the guy.
Yeah.
You stole something.
Yeah, so the parable is about a rich man and a poor man. And I think it's worth noting that David did not know that this was a parable from the beginning. Like, he would have understood this as just another case being brought before him. As king, there's going to be plenty of people who come giving him something to judge. What is the right thing to do in this situation? And so it will end up being a parable. It will end up being something that reveals David's sin. But as far as he's concerned, he's thinking of this as a real situation with a real injustice. And so the parable is about a rich man who has many flocks and herds, and then a poor man who has nothing but a little ewe lamb that he loved like a child. And the way that Nathan describes this in verse 3, that he brought it up, it grew up with him and with his children, that used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms. and it was like a daughter to him. So this is closer to a pet than livestock, very clearly. Jeff?
Yeah, Nathan had come in and went straight to the David who sinned and stuff like that.
Yeah.
A lot of the David on the defense instead
Mhm.
of looking at this other case, it made him, think, it made him more objective.
Right. And this is actually a really important idea that Jeff's talking about there, that there's a lot of situations where we view our own actions differently than we do other people's. I can see the sin that you commit and say, well, that's sin. That's obvious. You need to stop doing that. That's a sin against God, and you'll be condemned for it. And then when I sin in the same way, well, it's more complicated than that. There are reasons, there are excuses, there are contingencies and mitigating factors and all of these things that make it just a little bit more complicated when we're talking about me. Of course, that's not the way that it's supposed to be, but that's kind of human nature for us to want to judge others more harshly than we judge ourselves. So, yes, if Nathan had come to David and just immediately said, "You have sinned," that could have been a little bit more difficult. David might not be in the right frame of mind to be able to receive that, so Nathan's got to back him into it a little bit. Remember, at this point, David has been accelerating his stubbornness throughout the rest of the previous chapter. With every step of the way where he could have put the brakes on this, where he could have stopped adding more sin to the pile, he kept on sinning. And so there's a very real expectation here that David is going to double down yet again. Aaron?
Yes, it's easier for us to see the faults in others
Yeah.
than it is to see them in ourselves. So this is a great example of something that we should learn on how to do a self-analysis, how to judge ourselves by asking the question, how would I feel if somebody did this to me, or how would I feel if somebody did this to my wife, or
Yeah.
my daughter, or my son, to kind of detach from the situation and look at it as objectively as possible.
And that is a skill. Like that takes some work and some practice to be able to do. The Bible talks a lot about the need for us to be able to examine ourselves, to see where we are going, and to judge ourselves by the true standard of God's word. That doesn't come naturally. That's not going to happen without some practice. So, but that's a good point.
Another point, Nathan had faith in God, like you touched on earlier. Kings sometimes, were the absolute, and they do whatever they want. God sent Nathan to David to give him this message. It's like, man, do I really want to go there? Yes, he did. He followed God. It's like, I'm going to tell David, which you want me to go. He couldn't have cost me my life, because he could tell me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Nathan has no idea what's going to happen going forward. We know the end of the story. Nathan doesn't at this point. So, Lisa?
It's also interesting, and something for us to learn is how to approach someone in a way that is, well, I read books by Dale Carnegie that gets lots of how to express a different people.
Mhm.
Things they said is you can put something in a form where you're not actually pointing the finger directly at that person, you're giving them an analogy of behavior that they're practicing,
Yeah.
that they have an easier time seeing the logic of it. And so I think David, because David is going to point the finger to this guilty of this sin against God, instead to put it in a story that aroused an emotion in David.
Yeah.
But when David responded, it was, it came back to him exactly what was happening, and it struck him deeper in his heart than it would have been just kind of pointing to that.
Yeah, there's some tact and some wisdom in the way that Nathan is doing this. trying to have the best possible end with anything he can control. He can't control David's reaction, but he can set David up the best way possible. Dave?
Well, the interesting thing, some of the interesting things to me is that we put the list of offenses from David. Now, David was a man of God, and he should have known at least one of them should have affected him.
Yeah.
Right? He stole Uriah's wife, but he conspired to have him murdered, and did. And he conspired to steal her.
Yeah.
And the thing is, God, it's interesting, God sent Nathan, and the reason I think he sent him is he went through before to give him a blessing.
Right.
And so I think David probably would be more receptive to Nathan
Yeah.
than just someone going up, hey, you do this.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that God did that. But the takeaway for that one is God will not keep doing it. He says in Genesis that he will not strive forever doing that. He will not strive with us forever. He will not wait forever. He's going to tell me, telling me, telling me, refusing, refusing. So the point that strikes me funny is that how David was so quick. And I think that's in the rest a lot. Quickly judge that person. Wow, that's terrible.
Yeah.
And not even reflecting one little bit. And like I know Aaron is not reflecting one little bit on all this stuff he did was just really, I know we look at it now, but it's horrible. What
Yeah.
he was doing. There's nothing like God. So I think God had a purpose in sending me for that reason, to get him to listen.
Absolutely. Nathan has already had interaction with David before, has already brought a blessing to him previously. David's got to learn a hard lesson here, though, and got to have something exposed that he's not going to be very happy to hear. And if you, by the way, are at all worried that when we're talking about this, trying to set people up for the best possible reaction, or maybe, using an indirect path to get to their guilt, and you think, well, that sounds weak. That sounds like we're not being truthful and pointed. We're willing to be as pointed as we have to be. The Bible is pointed, and Nathan's going to get pointed, but tact and wisdom are valuable too. And there's a lot of different ways to show someone their sin. And if you don't have to get to the extreme that Jesus did sometimes of saying, you whitewashed tombs, you hypocrites, you people who don't know what you are doing and you don't know the scriptures, sometimes it comes to that, and sometimes you can do it a little bit softer and they will end up seeing it. Ultimately, the truth is what matters.
Well, using reason in this way, you kind of avoid the human response in trying to make a defense for yourself.
Right.
He takes away David's defense in this before David ever says a word.
Yeah.
So, and people will come up with excuses for anything that they do, especially if we come right at them with it. Well, David says, well, I don't want to do this. Nathan took away all excuses before he ever gave David the option of making the decision and judgment on it.
Right. Yeah, David will be backed in a corner. He's not going to be able to make excuses because he's already judged the situation. So, yeah, the way this parable goes, right, the rich man and the poor man, the rich man is not willing to slaughter one of his own animals to be able to provide food for a traveler who's come in. He goes to that poor man and he takes that little ewe lamb. He doesn't have the right to take that other man's lamb. And it's all the worse. It would be, bad enough if they had an equal number of animals and equal wealth. You still don't have the right to go to somebody else and take their animal from them. But it seems even more severe when you don't have that equity. where the rich man has plenty to spare, yet he goes and takes the poor man's only lamb. So, yeah. Okay.
Again, I think it's interesting how Bathsheba is viewed.
Mhm.
Here she's viewed as the little ewe lamb,
Yep.
and she's always referred to as, every place, almost every place you see her referred to, she's still referred to as the wife of Uriah. Even
Yeah.
in the lineage, in the first chapter of Matthew, doesn't give her name, it just says the wife of Uriah.
Yeah.
That is interesting to me.
And that, I think, like, these observations are the justification for what we talked about last week, that you can debate what Bathsheba's choices could have been in this and whatever guilt she might have had, but really the narrative is much more concerned with David's guilt and sets Bathsheba up as a lot closer or entirely an innocent victim in this, one who has been victimized, one who has been stolen, taken. That's the word for how David got her, that he took her. Not just that he wooed her or convinced her, but that he took her. And so this is a story of David's guilt more than anything about Bathsheba. And yes, the record of Scripture reflects the dishonor that was done here, that she was rightly Uriah's wife, yet David is the one who took her. So what are David's two reactions to this injustice? There's kind of two things that he said. Or Lisa. Oh, sorry, Gabby.
I just wanted to make a comment on a more broad scale that, you don't know David's life or his history, and you're reading this from the beginning, and you're seeing, how David has been blessed so much by God, and then how he starts doing these things, and it really is an example of how, for us in our lives, when things are going so well for us and God has blessed us, and we start to let our guard down, and that's the moment that Satan, we become vulnerable to sin, and we let Satan into our hearts, and I think that's exactly what is happening with David. He's letting his guard down.
Yeah, even a man as great as David is vulnerable to sin, is vulnerable to giving in to temptation, and he does that here. This isn't even the only place that he does it. What I take comfort in this is that David does not have to be defined by his worst moments, because there is grace for him in the end of this story and in all of the times that he sinned against God. And he's called a man after God's own heart, and we don't want to be defined by our worst moments either. If you think back to the worst things that you've ever done, is that what you want your legacy to be? Is that what you want the definition of your life to be? I don't want that for me. And that's what God offers us, that forgiveness, that grace to be pulled out of the sin that we are in, to be purified and restored, to be rightfully with him. That's what David's going to get throughout this. So there's a warning for us and some hope for us, because objectively we look at what David is doing and we think, good people don't do things like this. Except that, sometimes good people do things like this. Through their lapses of judgment, through their weak moments, through their, giving in to temptation, that we can break the character that we have, we can break the habits that we have, and can go astray. And sometimes for longer than this. But God wants us to come back to him. Dave.
I just wanted to point out that in all of this, David, none of us in here, we're all susceptible to this.
Yeah.
Our own desires first. And sometimes we do, and we should. And we should be attentive. But the thing
Yeah.
He really murdered. And so I want to point out the long-reaching damage that's done to his families,
Yeah.
his side, and that sheep's family, and all that. I mean, it destroys stuff. You know, it's destruction. Satan loves that. And so I think about that kind of thing, and I'm with David about, oh, it's going to do what I want. And then he did twice about it.
Yeah.
And that's a bad thing. So this is something we should really pay attention to. But a low rung of the ladder we can go get to and sin, and keep doing more and more and more and more. And not even considering the long-term destruction of
Yeah.
the church, the relationship we have with God, and the families that are involved.
Yeah. Sin tends to spiral and corrupts us further and further, and there's consequences that we don't always think about, especially in the moment. But yeah, there's what a lot of people are missing is the step in between. You know, we say, okay, David did these horrible sins, you know, but none of us are perfect. You know, we make our mistakes. You know, I generally try to be a good person. And so then the result is we just sweep it under the rug. Or we soften it and we tell people, hey, your sin's not that big of a deal because we all sin sometimes. The missing step in between is there's still the condemnation of sin. There's still the fact that we need to repent and make it right and seek God's forgiveness. And then we have his mercy. And that's what David has to do here. It doesn't get overlooked just because he's king or just because we all sin sometimes. He's going to need to be brought to answer for what he has done. Yes, Gary.
I know we haven't gotten there yet, but since David brought up consequences,
Yeah.
verse 14, also people that are enemies, people that they just jump all over stuff like that.
Yeah.
See all the hypocrites. That's why I'm not a believer.
Right. Yeah. Given cause for people to drag God's name through the mud. Because this is the king of God's people. This is someone who follows God. So now God's name has been harmed even by this event. So what are David's two reactions to the injustice that Nathan has told him about? Aaron?
Well, he's angry. You can see clearly the injustice that was done.
Yes.
To this stranger that he has never met.
Yeah.
And rightfully so.
Yeah.
He orders, repayment of fourfold
Yeah.
of the animal and then death.
Yeah. Yeah, so like the way I read it is like, him first saying this man deserves to die, and then maybe like softening it a little bit to the appropriate thing. I guess there's a couple ways that you could read it. That's really, if you look at the law, like death is not the appropriate punishment for stealing somebody's animal. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, you can read it a couple ways.
Yeah.
David is potentially, like, overcompensating
Yeah.
for the injustice, just,
Yeah.
knowing that he's got this sin.
Yes.
He wants to
Yeah.
come across as, this is wrong, we can't stand for this, and
Yeah.
that is, again, we're talking about human nature. That's
Right.
another part of human nature.
That is another thing we
When
do.
we have a problem with something,
Yeah.
we tend to overcompensate for that and try to come across as extra righteous.
Yes. Yeah, that is a good point. And that may very well be what David is doing here, that he's bringing to the harshest punishment possible, even out of his own guilt. In the old law, the normal punishment for stealing something was you had to repay double. And then there was also kind of an enhancer to that sometimes you could repay 4 times in cases that were especially bad or when that is judged harsher. So David has definitely put the harsher judgment on that, even with the repayment side. You repay 4 times. And, depending exactly how you want to read it, I don't really know. It's not going to be ultimately that important. With him saying the man who has done this deserves to die, Whether that's David's, just first reaction that he's then moderating, or whether he really intends to go through with that. The point is, he's angry and he is enraged by the injustice and the sin, and he wants that to be righted in the most extreme way possible. That will be a little bit unfortunate for David as it comes out that this is a parable about him.
Because of the word "and" there, I read it as both of them are going to happen. David is saying, not only am I going to punish the person, but I'm going to restore as much as I can to the victim.
Yeah.
I'm going to take care of that. Punish the person and restore. So.
Yeah. And David's reasoning for this, what David cites is that, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. So he views this as not just a crime of opportunity or a crime of laziness or a crime of passion, but a crime of complete lack of pity. And we even see, like in our justice system, that often, judges and juries take into account whether this is, like how this came to be, how somebody decided to commit that crime that they did. Was this cold and calculated? Was this done without any remorse? Is the defendant still not sorry for what they did? That tends to not go well for you in a courtroom, right? That's kind of what David's saying here. Like this man is beyond the pale. He's gone way too far. He did it without pity. He deserves to die. He will pay back fourfold. This is, completely incomprehensible. Now, of course, Nathan reveals to David, that critical verse, verse 7, "You are the man." This is a parable. We're not talking about a ewe lamb. We're not talking about something as simple as stealing an animal. And as angry as you have become over that, you need to see that the situation is far worse. And so Nathan goes on to deliver this message from God. And I want to ask you, why is God so angry with David? Because God's angry. Dave.
Well, he reveals it. And he says that you despise my command, and you did all these wicked things. And that word "despise," that is a bad word.
Yeah.
In your relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
I believe. So, did he take it to heart? Eventually, I'll hope to.
Yeah.
But it's just, that's I don't know what other folks here have their version say. Mine says despise.
Yeah. I've despised as well, and that's a strong word for sure. Gary.
And God brought up how tremendously God had blessed David.
Yeah. Look at everything I've given you. Was it not enough? What do I have to give you for you to not despise my word? I recommend not answering that question, right? That's just a horrible situation now for David to be in. Yeah. He said, I would have given you more. That if it really isn't enough, God has shown so much love toward David, so much desire to bless him and to make him great. He has given David everything he's asked for up to this point. And David is still going beyond and is taking what is not his. So what do we think about the fact that God said in verse 9 that you have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword? Did he do that?
God cannot lie.
Yeah, he did. And this actually is a lesson here for us, that even sins done kind of indirectly that way, done through someone else, or, the kinds of excuses we make, that well, I didn't do it personally, it wasn't by my hand. God sees right through that. that does not matter at all. David ordered for that to happen. David intended for that to happen. There is no difference to God with David doing it with this scheme or David picking up his sword and cutting him down himself.
Yeah, I mean, you used the right word. David ordered it
Yeah.
to be done. It's, you know, it would have been the same thing if Uriah was put right before him and he asked for the executioner to
Yeah.
take off his head.
Yeah. And, we feel a little bit better sometimes if we don't have to see it happen or if we don't have to do it ourselves. But none of that is any different. David could do it personally. David could watch it happen, or David could be far away and order it. It really doesn't matter. All of it is still murder, and God will hold him accountable for it. So yes, you have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. And yeah, God showing there, you did it with the sword of the Ammonites. Again, no difference. So in all of this, what we talked about last week in chapter 11, that this is a multifaceted sin, like God is revealing here as well. That the sin has been against so many different people. This was not just a sin against Bathsheba. This was not just a sin against Uriah. This is a sin against a whole bunch of different people. And most importantly, a sin against God himself. And God is not pleased. So what punishment then does God give to David? Aaron.
The sword will not depart from his house is one punishment. His wife will be taken. What he did in secret will be done against him in public.
Yeah.
And ultimately the child will die.
Yeah.
That's the deed.
Yeah. That's a lot. That's a lot there. You can see God is angry. And with the trouble in his family, like there's, I don't know, you could maybe think of it as coincidence or maybe think not, that over the course of David's life, 4 of his sons are going to die prematurely. And David said that rich man should repay 4-fold for the lamb that he took. Well, David ends up repaying 4-fold in 4 of his sons that die before their time, so to speak. And there's more punishment on top of that. So the kind of judgment that David made against the hypothetical rich man is the kind of judgment that's being made against him. And David has already said this is a right and just thing to do. So he really doesn't have any room to complain when God is applying that very same standard back to him. Yes, please.
That's a great point, because if you look at it from that same perspective, God is like trying to not execute him the way he would otherwise judge that man.
Yeah.
And God's showing mercy here. And
Right.
I think he's grabbing onto that mercy and holding on that mercy. And the reason I think that is the Psalms.
Right. There is mercy here, and it doesn't seem like there's mercy here because there's a lot of punishment, but there absolutely is. I said earlier that the punishment for stealing an animal is typically not death in the Old Testament. That's not really the normal punishment. But what about adultery? What about murder? Like, that is the punishment. that those weren't capital offenses in the law of Moses. So David is twice over, worthy of death according to God's covenant with Israel. Yet God is not going to kill him. He's just going to bring a lot of punishment against him. Okay?
Well, he said, Lord, put away your sin, and you shall not die.
Yeah.
And that's what we all want.
Right.
We all want him to put away our sin and let us live with him in eternity.
Those are the beautiful words we want to hear. It would be better if we had never sinned in the first place, but we're past that point, right? That's the coulda, woulda, shoulda of the past. We all have sinned, and so then the question becomes, what will happen to us now? Are we doomed to die, or is there mercy that can be extended to us? We know there is mercy for those who seek God and for those who obey him. And so that's what God will extend to David here because of David's reaction. And I want to spend a moment here to compare and contrast David's response to the prophet's condemnation with Saul's response in 1 Samuel 15, because they both have similar types of situations where they've sinned against God, and a prophet comes and reveals that sin to them. Remember, 1 Samuel 15 was the war against the Amalekites. They were told to utterly destroy them, kill everyone and everything, don't bring any animals or people or spoil back. And Saul left the king alive and took the best of the animals, and it was a whole problem. So what's the same or different with their responses? Yeah, Sue.
Saul had making excuses, trying to blame the people. David did not try to blame Bathsheba. He accepted the sin himself.
Yes. Saul's first reaction was, well, I didn't do that. And Samuel literally had to say, well, what do I hear then? I hear all these animals. Let's not be foolish. You and I both know that you did it. And then, Saul makes all these excuses. Well, it wasn't really me, it was the people. Or if it was me, then, it was for God. It was for a sacrifice. His story is changing all the time. And it's all trying to exonerate his own actions. David doesn't do that. David has shown a lot of stubbornness up to this point in this account, and that is not good. But to his credit, once his sin is revealed to him, he owns up to it. And that's his response. Verse 13, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And that's only 2 words in Hebrew. That's as simple of an answer as he could give, knowing that, yes, he is guilty. Steve? Steve Cagle? No?
grandson, somebody hacked through a database or some dating site or something, and caused 200 breaches to resign. My point is just I think God seems a little bit, I don't know that I'm sorry, women are attractive. It's just, it's a tough thing to
And that is the reality that is described in Scripture, and the reality along with that is we're told to have self-control, to be controlled, and to not sin in the ways that the world says are inevitable, that we have to give into. I remember that that event you're talking about, that dating website was one specifically designed for people looking to cheat. I don't know if you remember hearing about that in the news. It was a cheaters dating website, and their membership got leaked, and so people's names were then exposed publicly as being on a website for cheaters. And there were a lot of people who were exposed, including people in positions of authority, including people, religious leaders, including preachers and people like that. And that was a very shameful thing for a lot of people. Yeah. And see, like, that's the thing, that we think that our sin will be able to stay covered up forever, that, we can keep it hidden, but sin has a way of being brought to light. Dave?
Well, I see, one of the things I see here, how God is a God of justice, and that he, ironically, okay, you're going to lose all your wives, and you're going to get your seed in your neighbors. Now, the first thing, as I pointed out a couple weeks ago, David shouldn't have had more than one wife. He was
Yeah.
told not to. And
Right.
that's where it started. But can you imagine him standing there? I don't know how many he had, but he lost and watched God give it to his neighbors. I mean, I don't know how that all played out, but
Yeah.
it could have been a fun thing.
Right.
And that shows, but here about the consequences, that shows us, it should show
Yeah.
that there are consequences. They may be short-term, they may be long-term,
Yeah.
unexpected, but they're going to happen.
Yeah.
So I love God's ironic sense of justice.
Yeah.
Okay, now you're going to see what it's like. You're going to taste that.
I always, wonder a little bit with people, like, adulterers who are offended when their spouse cheats on them, or, when, okay, you're in an adulterous relationship, you've cheated with someone, maybe now you're with them, you marry them, and then they cheat on you later, and are you surprised? They cheated with you. You don't think they'll cheat on you? And they're offended by that. They believe it's a great harm done to them, yet they were willing to do it previously. Jeff?
And just comparing Saul to David, so I'm not sure, I believe it is, but, Psalm 51.
I think so.
Psalm of David.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. And,
Yeah.
it talks about him, wanting God's mercy.
Yeah.
And that he remembers, David, or the psalmist here, remembers his sin and stuff, and wants God's mercy.
Yeah.
Well, he wants that forgiveness and stuff, instead of being arrogant, God, he's humble himself.
Yeah. There's a few Psalms that really help to flesh out what's going through David's head throughout all of this. That's not described here. We see David describing being eaten up from within, of being paralyzed by his guilt and his grief over this, and simply seeking God's mercy, the forgiveness that he knows he doesn't deserve, but that he desperately wants. David does not want to be the man that he was in 2 Samuel 11. Okay?
Well, there's a good lesson here for us women. I don't know exactly how she got to take off her baby. I don't think she did that intentionally.
Yeah.
But as women, we need to be very careful that we don't dress ourselves in a way to cause men to sin.
And again, whatever the situation was with Bathsheba, I think these stories of adultery and the sin that happens there should be a cautionary tale, not just to us in, be self-controlled and don't give in to those temptations and those desires, but also respect the sanctity of marriage to an extreme degree. That I am not, and I'll apply it to men as well, that let's not do anything that is going to get between someone's marriage, going to tempt anyone else. I'm not going to, we don't want to dress in a way that is going to be provocative to others. We don't want to, stand to hear someone bad-mouthing their spouse, and you don't want to give them that outlet where they can be degrading their marriage to your ear. That you're going to respect the fact that that person is not your wife, not your husband, and whether they're married or not, for their current spouse or their future one, you are not going to dishonor them or pose any stumbling block to them. Now, I am also sensitive to the fact that you can do everything right on your end and still be victimized and still be harmed by people who have given in to their own lust. It's not fair or right to pin that all on one person. But still, we do what we can, and then we expect for others to live up to God's standard as well. Looks like I'm running out of time. So next week we will talked about God's response a little bit here. I want to really talk about why God insists on killing a child that is born to Bathsheba. God gives David some grace, but does not take away all the punishment. And maybe that seems harsh to you. Let's spend some time talking about that. And we'll talk about David's grief as well, while his son is sick and all the events around that. There's a good bit left for us to discuss in chapter 12, so we'll do that. Thank you.